All right, there are a lot of YouTube videos saying that the barefoot industry is lying to you. And there are a lot of people who've been saying that if you go barefoot, you're going to get injured. We're going to chat about the reality of that and what you can do about it if you're interested in being a happier, healthier runner on today's episode of the Movement, the podcast for people who want to know the truth about what it takes to have a happy, healthy, strong body, starting feet first, because, those things are your foundation. And we break down the propaganda, the mythology, sometimes the outright lies you've been told about what it takes to run or walk or hike or do yoga or CrossFit, whatever it is you like to do, and to do that enjoyably and effectively and efficiently. And did I say enjoyably? Trick question. I know I did. Because look, if you're not having fun, you're not going to keep it up. So, make sure you're having fun doing what you're doing. I am Stephen Sashin, CEO, co-founder of Zero Shoes and the host of the Movement podcast. And we call it that because we, including you, are creating a movement about natural movement, letting your body do what it's made to do. And the part where you can help is really, really easy. There's no cost involved. There's no time involved, really. It's simple. If you want to find out more, go to our website, www.jointhemovement.com. You'll find all the previous episodes, all the ways you can interact with us on social media, and just, leave a review and a thumbs up and give us a 5-star rating, all those things you know how to do to help people find out about what we're up to. In short, if you want to be part of the tribe, just subscribe. So before I introduce our guest, you may notice I'm not at the Zero Shoes headquarters with a bunch of shoes behind me. B, I'm not wearing a Zero Shoes t-shirt. And C, I have a whole bunch of hardware all over me because I had some shoulder surgery on Tuesday. This tube is going to the thing that's running cold water to this. And then I got a brace on. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. It's all very entertaining. So just wanted to let you know why that's going on and what's up. But more importantly, let us chat. Hey, Rafi, do me a favor. Tell people who you are and what you're doing here.
Sure. So my name is Rafi Salazar. I'm an occupational therapist by trade. I own a physical therapy clinic in Augusta, Georgia, home of the Masters if you're into golf. And we're here to talk about what the research and the evidence shows about transitioning from conventional running to minimalist running and just a natural gait pattern.
Before we do that, I didn't know you were in Augusta. When I was doing stand-up comedy for a living, one of my first gigs was in Augusta, Georgia, where on the opening night, they surprised us by saying, hey, Soupy Sales wants to come and do 10 minutes. It was like, nice. What? I don't know that anyone even knew who Soupy Sales was then, and I know a lot of people don't now. But that was, FYI, really nice guy. Largest head I've ever seen on a human being. Utterly fascinating. Just ginormous noggin. So now, before we jump into this, and first of all, thanks. One of the things that I've noticed in the people who are complaining about the whole barefoot world. And by the way, we're not even necessarily going to suggest that you run in bare feet. That's a whole other story. But one thing that I hear people saying all the time is one of two things. One is, hey, the barefoot industry is lying to you, which I find very interesting because the things that these people then say are things that I have never said. In fact, I say the opposite of many of those things they say. And the guys at Vivo Barefoot, same thing, have never said those things. And the two of us are the two largest companies in the world promoting minimalist footwear and natural movement. So that part's really interesting to me. But there's one other part that I want to see if we can start with. And that is when people talk about switching to either running barefoot or in minimalist footwear, they talk about injuries and the possibility of getting injured, and they never compare the potential injuries or the actual injury risk in running barefoot or minimalist to the actual injury risk that has been measured for 45 years of people running in regular shoes. I can say more about that, but do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is running as a sport in the amateur world anyways, probably in the pro world too, has one of the highest injury rates. In some cases, some studies put it as high as like 85% of amateur runners experience some kind of injury over the course of their running career. So basically like 8 or 9 out of 10 runners experience some kind of running related injury. And it's usually lower extremity, foot, plantar fasciitis, hip, knee, back issues, something like that.
The number that gets bandied around quite a bit also is like 50% of runners, 80% of marathoners get injured every year. But my favorite thing about this, and I'm going to see if we can get it in the show notes, Nike did a study about 4 years ago. They published it right before COVID, partly. They sent out a press release. They never actually published the study, but the press release said that they had a new shoe that reduced injury rates by 52%. And on their website now, they actually have the abstract, but they still haven't published the study for a couple of reasons that I just realized, where it says they compared their best-selling running shoe to a new running shoe, and the new running shoe reduced injuries by 52% over a 12-week half marathon training program. And in fact, It did. But then you have to look at the numbers. In their best-selling shoe in 12 weeks, over 30% of the people got injured. And in the new shoe, only 14.5% did. And now, I mean, this is an amazing thing. This is like me saying to you, all right, I'm going to buy you dinner every night this week. You can pick one of two restaurants, one where you'll get food poisoning, roughly, the odds are about 1 in 7, and the other where the odds are like 3 in 7. Which one do you want to go to? And of course, the answer would be, what, are you crazy? So, but I think they haven't published the results because they defined an injury as anything that kept people from running for at least 3 training sessions. Now, I suspect that if they actually showed how long people got injured for, those numbers were much, much higher. And so, if after 45 years, this is the best they can do, is injuring 15 to 30% of the people in just 12 weeks, and injury rates go up, then that's a problem. And, that's what we need to compare ourselves to. If anything, I mean, my God, look, if at Zero Shoes, if we were injuring 30% of the people wearing our shoes in 12 weeks,
probably got out of business.
I'd probably be in jail. So, it's an amazing standard that we're not being held to, or even more interestingly, that they're not being held to. So anyway, I just want to kind of frame that in this conversation about what it takes from your perspective and the research for people to, and again, I think this transcends running, but anyway, to have a transition from whatever they're doing in whatever shoes they're currently wearing to something more natural and arguably better for you.
Yeah. Well, I think it's from a standpoint of just like on the logic of it, if you get injured, you get plantar fasciitis or whatever, you have weak arches, like the idea of, okay, we just need to put more support or more cushion or whatever makes a lot of sense on the surface. Like, oh, that's common sense. I get injured because of the way my foot is striking the ground. So I just put more cushion and I'll be fine because it won't be striking as hard. But what we fail to really understand in that logic is what it does, one, to the entire kinetic chain, but then the the whole neuroscience of it, and motor control, and what it does to have impaired or inappropriate motor patterns when you're doing something over the long term, and what that does for repetitive strain injuries and all of that. So on the surface, cushion supportive shoes sounds like a great idea because of course we're going to be decreasing the impact force. But the research would suggest.
Yes, I was going to say except, and I'll let you continue. I'll give you a little one-liners just to keep rolling on this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it does, quote, make sense. If you don't think about it too hard, if you don't know anything about physics in particular. And this is the part that and when the big maximally cushioned shoes started coming out, I'm a former All-American gymnast. And the first thing I thought literally immediately was foam is like a trampoline. It doesn't give you anything back. It's what you put into it. And like a trampoline, it's tuned to a particular weight and a particular speed. If you're not that weight and that running at that speed, it's just going to get in the way. There's no such thing as energy return. There's just energy loss. And it's just a question of how you mitigate that. But then this is a bit of a tangent, but something I've been thinking about a lot lately. In 1971, a guy named Delano Merriweather. Do you know him?
I heard his name. Yeah.
Then you're a rare one because most people don't. He has the world record to this day in the 100-yard dash because they switched to meters after he set that world record. And he was running in shoes that are much more like ours, thin, flexible, lightweight on a crappy track surface, frankly. And he ran a 9 flat 100 yards, which equates to about a 9.800 meters, which would make him like the 4th fastest guy in the world today. And he wasn't even taking any drugs. So it's, people have no sense of history as well when we have this conversation. So in addition to the misunderstanding of physics and kinetics, they don't have a sense of history. Yeah.
And for most people, history starts the day you were born, right? So there's
I never thought about that. Yeah.
That's one of the things you hear on the politics side of things. Oh, history starts for many people the day they were born. So if it happened after, before that, they're not even listening. The same is true for
anything, it seems.
Too, yeah.
Well, it's because we're Americans. In Europe, they have a whole different sense of that.
Yeah.
And Asia as well. So before we jump into the specifics of this, I'm curious, what got you here? Because now, first of all, 13, 14 years ago, when the barefoot boom started booming, there was very little research, and there was very little incentive to do any research because who's going to pay for it? And so, but now it's a different story, both research about what we're doing and research about what quote normal shoes are doing. But where did you start, and how did you end up here?
Sure. Yeah. So I was 29 years old, and I wanted to run, after having been relatively sedentary. I wanted to run a half marathon before my 30th birthday. I had a kid a couple years before that. This was 2015. I had my first son, and I was like, I want to be one of those active dads. I don't want to be like, oh, go play out in the backyard. I can't move. My back hurts or whatever. So I started running back in 2015, had been doing that on and off for a few years. And then 2019 rolled around. I was like, you know what? I'm going to run a half marathon. And in that half marathon, which I ran in a time of 1:58:22, so I'm proud of that, under 2 hours, ended up having a stress fracture in my foot. And it was one of those, you cross train for a while, maybe on a stationary bike until the foot heals. And then for the next couple of years, I was really just plagued with all kinds of running injuries. It was right knee pain and left knee pain and back pain. I had an MRI on one of my knees and was told that I had chondromalacia patella and would need to take it easy and buy some supportive shoes. And shortly, kind of after getting over the knee pain, it was my mom actually was like, oh, I just got these shoes, these Zero shoes. You should really look into them. And at the time, I was a professor at the university teaching in the OT department, teaching evidence-based practice. And I was like, everything she was saying was one of those, like the spider sense in the back of my mind was like, no, there's no way this is true. Like, there's no way this is curing plantar fasciitis. There's no way it's doing all that. So I dug into the research a lot. And what I came to find was that, and I've heard you say this, I think a few times on different podcasts, like, when you dig into the research, it's not so much that the shoes themselves are fixing the problems. It's the benefits that you receive by having more proprioceptive input in the bottom of your feet, right? Because the proprioceptive input, or really just the sensory input of walking and having flexible footwear, informs your movement patterns. And over time, doing one movement pattern one way for 5 miles either leads to some injuries or you can build real strength. And that's kind of what got me started on it. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to try some of these natural or barefoot running shoes. And I started doing that, I don't know, 2020-ish, 2021-ish, and just haven't looked back. I don't think I've run in a pair of cushion shoes in a long time. And what I tell people that come into the clinic, what I tell folks on the podcast and stuff like that is, again, it's like the shoes themselves are not a cure-all. It's the benefits that you get from wearing those shoes. So my mom was right. The shoes were helping her, but not in the way that she thought.
Well, so that's true. So I'm intrigued by this. It's a rare human being who, when presented with information that conflicts with what they believe, goes, instead of immediately thinks of a million ways to argue against that point.
Confirmation bias, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it makes sense. It's an evolutionary thing. We're wired to stick to what we believe, because it would take, if we had to rethink something every time we encountered it, we'd be dead. Something would have eaten us by now.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you remember, I want to kind of pick this apart for the fun of it. What was I'm like thinking about slowing the film down frame by frame. So your mom says, hey, you got to try these out. And she's talking about all these things where she was, in the right direction, but not necessarily for the right reason. What happened? Like when you said your spotty sense was tingling, can you A, say more about that? And B, tell me what you started researching, what you found when you actually dove in. Where'd you look and what'd you discover?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that the thing that she said that I was like, oh, no, she said, oh, I've had plantar fasciitis for years and now I wear these shoes and I don't have plantar fasciitis. And I was like, okay. So are you doing anything? And she's like, well, I'm exercising and stuff, but the shoes took away my plantar fasciitis. And I was like, we're going to dig into this. And being the research nerd that I am and having access to the, PubMed and some of those peer-reviewed research journals through the university, I just kind of did a search. And the research that was being published back then and probably still being published right now is like compares like quote unquote shod runners to barefoot or minimalist runners. And I didn't know anything about any of these terms when I was digging into it. And what I was looking at was I was trying to look at injury rates, but I was really looking at like the impact forces of running efficiency and things of that nature. So it's funny because even on the surface, there's one study, I can't remember where it was published, probably the Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Medicine or something like that. And they compared shod runners to barefoot runners, and over, I think it was a 6-week program or something, 6 weeks running on a treadmill, and they were testing stability of the ankle. And at the end of that research study, the conclusion was, well, the people that started running conventional shoes, they put them into barefoot shoes, and then they tested them for 6 weeks. They had more instability in their ankles than before. And so, we should be cautious about encouraging people to do minimal shoes or something like that. And being at the time doing research or teaching evidence-based practice, I was like, okay, like if I was to appraise this article, like what the conclusion that you're coming to, like, obviously is a no-brainer. If you take somebody from like stabilizing, like anti-pronation shoes, and you put them in basically no shoes or very flexible shoes, like, well, no duh, they're going to end up pronating more probably. They're going to have some more instability. But they never made the connection for me of, because they have instability, they will have more injuries. They couldn't make that connection. So I began digging a little bit more and ended up coming up with, it was a study published, I think it was in 2018, and it was in foot and ankle orthopedics. And it basically discussed foot exercises to transition people into barefoot to improve function, muscle size, foot pressure distribution, all kinds of stuff like that, with the ultimate goal of like reducing injuries. And what they showed was like it was 4, we call them the core 4 exercises in the book, but the core 4 foot exercises, which are basically like seated doming, standing doming, you're trying to just work the intrinsic muscles of the foot, and toe spreading. They equated that to increased endurance and ability in like heel raises and heel lifts, decreased instances of plantar fasciitis, actually increasing the natural arch of the foot. And that kind of got me down that rabbit hole of, okay, so obviously there's a connection here between the footwear that you choose and what that means for the function of your feet. Very similarly, my background as a clinician is like upper extremity hands. And we talk about all the time splinting people like in the wrist or the hand. And one of the big things we're worried about is intrinsic muscle wasting, losing the ability to grasp or to do fine motor things because you're splinting or immobilizing the muscles over long periods of time. And it's the same basic principle in the feet, right? So that kind of got me down the rabbit hole. And then I was like, okay, so now there's obviously some merit here to the idea of allowing the feet to move more, and then doing it in a targeted way to intentionally build strength, to decrease the risk of injury in the long term. Because really it's the strength and the foundation, like you said, of your body's movement, that kind of dictates whether or not you're going to get injured in the long run or not.
Well, I want to highlight something else that you said you did that most people don't do and can't do. And that is you looked at the research and then took a bit of a deeper dive into it. And what I mean, when I'm saying that is, I think about research, like almost any of the research that's comparing shod runners to barefoot runners, where they say, hey, we took some runners and we had them run barefoot.
Yeah.
It's like, well, 2 things. One, if you just put them in a brand new shoe, their running gait would change. In fact, I was in the lab with Dr. Bill Sands, and this is a thing he would do, is you'd come into his lab with every shoe you owned, and he would show that each shoe you wore changed your gait. So, that's one thing. And for the things about, quote, running efficiency, which is not about how well you run, it's measuring VO2 max or something, how much energy you're expending when you're running. There's 2 things that are interesting about that. One, again, if you're just switching to something radically new, it's a new movement pattern that's unfamiliar, that's going to be make a change, and it's going to be more difficult. And then the other thing, basically what I'm saying is that very rarely can you actually find out more about the cohorts, about the people that they're using in the studies. That's the one thing.
Yeah.
And the other is whether they paid any attention to form. Because even if you switch someone barefoot, especially on a treadmill, they can have shitty running form. They can still be overstriding, heel striking, do all these things. And no one ever seems to look at that or measure that. This is like in the early days when doctors would say, oh, I love this barefoot running thing. I'm getting more patients than ever. It's like, well, first of all, you said that in the early 70s when running shoes came out. And secondly, when someone came in and said they got injured running barefoot, did you ask them if they were actually running in bare feet or not? Well, no. And did you look at any video of them running? And do you know how to analyze their running form? Well, no. So, well, it's not about the footwear, it's about the form. And if you don't know what you're looking at, then you're just making up a whole story. But there's a guy here in town. I'm usually reluctant to mention his name, but I will. I think he might have retired, Roger Crom. And Roger, he would say that he was using accomplished barefoot runners to compare in his studies. And I called him on it. I said, I know all the barefoot runners in this town. You didn't have any of them in your study. You had people who do some barefoot training as part of their long distance training, but they're not barefoot runners. They've never run like a mile on pavement, for example. So, but, not knowing who is actually being studied and not looking at the critical thing, like we both mentioned, form, not footwear, these things are massively misunderstood. And most human beings don't have the resources or the will to really dive in and see, is this study done well or not?
Yeah. Well, and I think it's one of those things like I had an edge, right? Because I was teaching this in the university. I went to grad school for this. Like part evidence-based practice is what clinicians at least should be on the surface doing. So being able to look at a study and kind of pick it apart more critically, like to your point, most of the studies out there comparing barefoot runners to non-barefoot runners, they basically take a cohort of conventional runners and then randomly assign them to,
right,
one way or the other. So if you take somebody who's run the last 20 years in regular cushion pronating, limiting shoes, and then you put them in barefoot shoes, like, of course, there's like, they haven't learned how to run in those shoes yet. So
right.
It just leaves a little bit to be desired.
So I want to slow the film down one more time. So you got a pair of shoes, and what was your experience when you put them on? And I mean, what did you do like the moment you got them, and what was your experience of that?
Sure. So what I did the first time I put some shoes on, and I won't mention them because they're a competitor of yours, and I know
okay.
You speak to
we're all friends.
Yeah. So I put them on. And I actually ran backwards for like 20 paces so that I could kind of feel I think it was a Marathon Training Academy podcast I'd listened to before then was talking about form. And they said the best way to get good running form is to run backwards because you're going to naturally land on your midfoot or your forefoot. You're going to be upright. Your elbows are going to be behind your body. You're just going to get in good running form doing that. And then so you run backwards, 15, 20 paces, and then you run forward a little bit, trying to maintain that form. And what I noticed very quickly was that I went backwards. It felt good. And then I went forward and started heel striking a lot. And it kind of hurt my feet because I was on pavement. And after probably about a block, my first run in minimalist shoes really lasted maybe a quarter of a mile. And that is because I'd read some of this research and was like, listen, there are people getting injured. I don't want to run like 4 miles and injure myself. So I ran about a quarter of a mile or so. And what I noticed was initially I was striking very, like most people, I was overstriding. I was striking on my heel. It was hurting me. And probably in the first, 100, 150 yards or so, I noticed that I began altering my gait pattern. I was changing and I was landing more on that midfoot, forefoot, and reducing some of those impacts on my heel. And that was kind of my first go at this. And so what I tried to do was then build up. So I was doing cross training so I wouldn't lose just functional capacity in the off days. And then I was just trying to extend longer and longer. And what I was trying to do is make sure that my form was good while I did the transition. And as soon as my form started breaking down, it was a sign to me of weakness. So I would just stop running then. I would go back. I'd do whatever kind of exercise I was doing at the time, because I kind of looked at it as a long-term transition. It took me ultimately, about 8 weeks or so before I was like back up to running a 5K or something like that and feeling good about it. But I was a spaz about the form. So I was not going to let myself run in poor form, especially after feeling it on my heel that first time. I was like, okay, there's a way to do this. And obviously it's a repetitive movement. I don't want to injure myself over a long period of time doing, heel striking for 2 miles in bare feet. So that's kind of what I did.
I've seen a number of people when they hear about this whole idea, and they hear that you're supposed to land midfoot or forefoot, they'll continue to overstride and then just point their toes, plantar flex.
Yeah.
When you were making that transition in that first 100, 150 meters, were you noticing any other changes in your gait and others? I mean, were you still overstriding and plantar flexing, or could you tell that you were getting your feet underneath you?
Initially, I was overstriding and kind of just plantar flexing. After a while, and part of this was kind of reading and listening and kind of really listening to my body too. Like I was landing more under me. And then what also happened was cadence. It kind of picked up as well. So the faster your cadence is, at least the research kind of supports this as well. The faster your cadence is, the harder it is to overstride.
Yeah. Well, there's a chart that I didn't save, and even if I did save, organization is not my skill set, where it was showing the relationship between cadence and force. And basically, for most people, as your cadence was picking up, the amount of force is reduced until you start picking it up significantly, and then basically once you start sprinting and you're putting a lot of force in the ground. But it was a nice U-shaped curve between cadence and force, and I wish I could find that piece of research again.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's about kind of finding that balance. So, and that's what I did. I just tried to build up, going from having run half a marathon and just having the capacity to like run 10 miles. Like it was maybe humbling a little bit. Like I was trying to fight the urge to run more because I knew I could run more, but I went into it with the vision that it was going to be a long game and that it was going to take some time to build up to that in the new. I was changing my running technique. I was changing my running form, and that takes time.
Well, here's a sort of personal question, not like, deeply probing or anything, but what you're describing is my favorite thing, which is you basically became your own coach. You were using the feedback you were getting to make these adjustments in real time. Did you have any sense that's what was actually happening for you? Is that just the way you're built anyway, and you didn't notice?
No, I mean, I kind of realized that what I was, again, because of my background in the clinic, like I kind of realized like what I was going to be doing involved learning new motor patterns. So I kind of nerded out a little bit and was like, okay, these are the movements that we want to do. If I'm going to be landing on my forefoot, on my midfoot, I need to get my feet up under my body. I need to get my back up. I need to worry about the posture. I can't be overreaching with my arms. And it was a matter of like, I was having to be very cognizant of it while I was running for those first, several weeks or months, like making sure that, okay, my form is good. I'm feeling it. This is what it feels like when I get out of sync, whether it be overstriding or reaching too far with my body or hunching over, whatever it happened to be. And it just took learning what right feels like.
Well, I love that you pointed out that you paid attention to what wrong feels like, because that's something that if we're not really aware of that, it's harder to learn what the right is.
Yeah.
So sometimes when I'm teaching people, I'll say, exaggerate this thing you're doing badly, because it's just so ingrained. You don't know what you're doing right or wrong. So you need to do something on either end of that spectrum to kind of wake up your brain enough to go, oh, okay, now I know where I'm starting at least. So that's a good one. I want to lead to a couple of things, but you mentioned something else that I really like. Actually, there's two things. One is thinking about the counterfactuals, thinking about when people are presented with this idea of running barefoot or minimalist footwear. No one ever seems to talk about the various places in the world where this is what they do without a problem. For years and years and years. They never use that as an example of, hey, this is possible. The excuse is always, yeah, but they grew up doing that. So, as if it's impossible to learn some new movement pattern at any point in your life. Like you can't learn to play the guitar once you're past the age of 7 is sort of the analogy for that one that makes no sense. And the other one that I love, and I'm dying to hear what your thoughts on this one is, I hear this one a lot from people. I go, yeah, but we didn't evolve to run, let's say barefoot or whatever on hard surfaces like this. What's your response to that? And I don't even know if there's actually been research, but I have thoughts about this one. I'm curious if you do.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I am not one of those wear or go barefoot or wear minimalist shoes all the time, no matter what, because there are times like, shoot, when I'm standing up on a concrete surface for a very long time, it's nice to have a little cushion. I think the reality is like if you look at the way our body really is designed to move and all that, like we evolved to run on uneven surfaces. Yeah, that makes sense on principle. But the reality is like once you learn the appropriate motor patterns, whether you're doing it on uneven surfaces or flat surfaces, the impact force is still being reduced if you're running appropriately. So I don't know. I feel like,
I think that's
I'm not too
answer.
convinced, you know?
Well, I mean, my version is you got to go to these places that we evolved on and in, because there's a lot of hard packed mud, which may as well be concrete with stuff sticking out of it that you don't want to step on or in.
Rocks and gravel.
I also love to say, look, as a former gymnast, we did not evolve to do double twisting, double backflips, but we can do them. We didn't evolve to, fly fighter jets, but we can do it. So I don't even know what this fallacy is called. It's sort of like the reverse naturalistic fallacy, which is if it's natural, it's good. This one is, I don't know what it is, but it's a misunderstanding of history and what we can do. There's got to be a name for that one somewhere.
Yeah. And I mean, the reality is like neuroplasticity, like our brains and as such, because our brains control our body and our motor patterns, like our brains change from the day we're born to the day we die. So there's no reason to think that you can't learn a new motor pattern, or you can't generalize a skill from, say, uneven surfaces to flat, hard surfaces if given the right time and training.
Great feedback. I mean, I will add to that, since you brought up neuroplasticity, and your experience took you about 8 weeks. For me, it was much faster. And for some people, it's longer, because people do have different propensities for neuroplastic change, for learning a new movement pattern, for adopting that, for feeling it. And of course, people will be better or worse at different things. So you might find that if you're running, you're not going to be as elegant as some guy who's a 2-hour, 5-minute marathoner who's just wired for that. But that doesn't mean that you can't find a way to do this that's enjoyable and works for you. I also like reminding people that there's lots of different ways you can run. There's different distances. So I'm a sprinter. I run as fast as I can in a straight line for a really short distance. I don't take turns around the track because I don't have a GPS watch and I don't like to get lost. So, but there are other people who, the idea of what I'm doing just is completely absurd, and they'll run 100-mile races and everything in between. So not only is there that thing of finding that taking your time to become your own coach, to listen and find this new optimal form, but then figure out what you want to do with it was a whole other piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think part of it too, with the taking the 8 weeks was more strength based than anything. Like the reality was I had been running in shoes that had limited the intrinsic muscle strength of my feet. So taking the time to really strengthen the right muscles in the kinetic chain. And it's been one of those things that, even now, like I'm still working. I had an injury maybe 3-4 months ago, 6 months ago in my glute med. And it was probably because of the way I was running. So now it's, one of the PTs in the clinic here has been working with me, and I've been strengthening that right muscle, that left side of that left glute, and working on it to address it really in the context of running, so I think it's one of those things too, like it's not only the neuroplasticity piece, but it's really the strength of the underlying muscles too. And you're going to find stuff like, okay, now that my feet is strong, the problem just moves up the kinetic chain. And now that, my knee is strong, now it's my hip. And now that my hip is strong, you'll play whack-a-mole probably your whole life. I think that the reality is just approaching it from this motor control strength-based approach, as opposed to trying to stabilize. Yeah.
Well, and I think it can go the other way around too. And what you just pointed out, the glute medius, which most people don't even know that they have, is when I was with Bill Sands, he was saying this is the number one thing that we do with runners is they just don't have any strength in their glute medius. And for anyone listening, just look that up and look up, and we can talk about strengthening exercise for that as well. I saw something on the trail the other day that blew my mind. This woman ran by me and her left leg looked totally fine. Everything, was in alignment, looked great. Her right leg, her knee was pointed inward, vastus valgus, and her right foot was still pointed outward. It was everted in a way that I've never seen. It was like corkscrewed. Yeah. And then I know she was a little overweight, and I noticed something that blew my mind. She had no right glute. I mean, I don't know if she had it removed, but I mean, literally, her left glute was a full looking thing in a slightly overweight woman, and her right glute was like flat as a pancake.
Atrophied, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, that's the thing. If you are not using your glutes at all of those things that happen downstream and you're turning your femur being internally rotated, rotating your knee, all of that, like it made total sense. And I was inches away from literally stopping her and saying, here's some exercises that if you do this, I guarantee that's going to constrict straighten out your leg and you're not going to be running like a dork. But I was not that rude. But if I see her again,
I say probably the way the message is delivered has something to.
Yeah, I don't know what the right way to deliver that message is, because it's certainly not, hey, when you ran by, I was staring at your ass. And that's definitely not the way to start that conversation. I don't know what the right way is. So this took us a while just to get to leading to where you started by saying you almost at the beginning said in the clinic. So talk about what you're doing now and with whom you're doing these things and what you're doing with these people.
Sure. Yeah. So we at the clinic have physical therapy. Obviously, we get people that are coming for all sorts of some ailments. On the running side of things, a lot of what we're doing is we don't push this whole idea of minimalist footwear or anything like that. We talk about just natural running patterns, really. So we wrote a book called The Natural Runner. It's an 8-week plan to transition from conventional heel striking, overstriding to a more natural running gait. So a lot of that involves exercises, both corrective and then endurance building, and then obviously running within the context of this program to try to get you to the point where, you could do this in thick cushion shoes if you want to. I would argue that you probably need a little bit more proprioceptive feedback, but if that's what you want to do, you want to keep your Hokas or whatever with their 50 millimeter cushions, go for it. Or if you want to go all the way and go barefoot, this program works for that too. Really, the idea was just to reduce people's injury by addressing the underlying strength component, the motor pattern, and the form. And that's kind of what we do with the natural running program. Do
you know about Isabel Sacco's research on foot strengthening and people running in regular shoes?
No, I have not.
Oh,
probably
so
into it though.
Isabel Sacco, Sacco, she had people do an 8-week foot strengthening exercise program and or split two people in quote normal shoes, split into two groups. One did this exercise program, the other didn't. And over the course of the year-long study, the ones who did just the initial 8-week exercise program had a 250% lower incidence of injury than those who didn't in regular shoes. Now, I add to that Sarah Ridge's study, which showed that if you just walk in minimalist footwear like ours, you can build foot strength as much as doing an exercise program. Now, no one's done the study yet showing you can just walk in minimalist shoes, run in regular shoes, and have a reduced injury rate, but kind of do the math. If you're walking in minimalist shoes, that builds foot strength as much as the same exercise program that Isabel used to show a reduction in injury rate. If that makes sense to you with the transitive property of injury, then go for it. But you'll get a kick out of that study. So I know people are going to want to hear a bit more about what's in your book without giving away the entirety of the book. So say more about what you're actually doing, or give people some examples of things they can do. And then before I forget, because if I don't ask this now, I'll forget. Have you thought about doing a study demonstrating the value of this program? Maybe you can. We
have thought about it. It's one of those being probably on the former academic institution side of things. Like I get, like a randomized control trial and all that just costs a lot of money to do.
It's true.
So, you can do, and I've been saying this for years in healthcare, like the value in healthcare tangent here, the value in healthcare is the data, the outcomes data, and what you can do with that, what you can demonstrate from that. So we're definitely all about tracking data and outcomes and trying to equate that. We're also dealing though with, probably a biased sample size of people that are coming in because they know that they have a problem here, an injury, and they're trying to fix it. They stay, right? They stay in the program as opposed to people who might come once or twice and then leave. So you don't get those outcomes. So down the line, research would be cool. If we could get funding or something, we'd be.
I have a friend who's I guess, how old is he now? He's got to be, almost 80. He's a doctor who does prolotherapy. He's actually the guy who taught prolotherapy to almost everyone in the country who knows it. And for people who don't know prolotherapy, you basically take a needle and you jab it into the tendon or ligament that's having some laxity problems or some tendinosis or tendonitis. And it basically selectively injures your body so that your body recruits things to heal that.
Microtraumas. Yeah,
exactly. And I said to Tom once, I said, talk to me about the research on Prolo. He goes, here's the research. I don't take insurance. I charge a lot of money and people come back.
Yeah.
Wait, sorry. I don't take insurance. I charge a lot of money. It's really painful. And people come back and refer their friends. So, there's a certain time where anecdotal information is actually valuable. But anyway, but backing up to what's in the program, let's walk through that. or run through that.
Yeah, run through that. Yeah, I like it. So it's a 7-day workout plan or 7-day workout week. And we adapted it from a great book it was published by Runner's World. It was called Train Smart, Run Forever. And we basically took the idea of the 7-day workout week and adapted it for this specific thing. But the author's idea was basically to be a lifelong runner, you obviously need to not just run, you need to work on all those things that break down over time, right? The right muscles, maybe it's endurance and functional capacity. So we kind of took that and adapted it for, okay, what does it mean for somebody transitioning from conventional running to natural running? What does that mean for their foot strength, their posture, all of that? So it starts with basically understanding those 4 foot exercises and then what they called weightless or barefoot weight bearing. And this is based off of a study that was published in the Foot and Ankle Orthopedics in 2018, but they basically outlined 4 exercises. 2 of them are similar. So there's seated foot doming, which is, trying to draw your feet up like that, like you're arching your feet. You do that standing.
So for people who are just listening, can you describe that again?
Yeah, you're basically putting your heel and your toes flat on the ground, and then you're keeping them on the ground. You're trying to pull them together, almost like you're crunching your foot up, trying to arch your foot. It's an isometric contraction. You're trying to hold it 3 to 5 seconds. And you do that while you're standing. So you're weight bearing, and then you're doing it, and then you're doing it while you're seated. And those are the first 2 exercises. The next one is plantar flexion and inversion. So plantar flexion is just pointing your toes, and then inversion is bringing the sole of your foot towards the midline of your body. So you're pointing your toes and bring them in. And then the last one is just spreading your toes, spreading them apart and closing them. And doing this in conjunction with what they call barefoot weight bearing, which is just walking around in bare feet for at least 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, increases the strength in your calves, your feet, obviously your foot muscles, and can decrease injuries going forward. So the title of that study is Can Foot Exercises and Going Barefoot Improve Function, Muscle Size, Foot Pressure During Walking, and Qualitative Reports of Function in People with Flat Feet. So what they actually did in this study was they measured the arch of people's feet over time during this program. And it was an 8-week program. And the majority of people who came in with like flat foot deformity did these exercises. They didn't do any other, they didn't run. They didn't do any other kind of exercise programs. They didn't wear orthotics. They just did these exercises. And then they walked around in bare feet. And the majority of them, I think 2/3 or so, ended up with actually defining or a defined arch at the end of 8 weeks. So it builds the intrinsic foot muscles of your feet, the muscles of your feet, which is kind of the platform for all of the running going forward. If you think about what a foot does biomechanically, like you've got this arch, and that arch can spring and kind of absorb some of the cushion. And then it's also stabilizing you as well. So that's kind of the first level is every single day you're going to do these foot exercises, and you're going to walk around with bare feet. Regardless of whether or not you're going to wear normal shoes when you're running or whatever, you're going to work on the intrinsic muscles of your feet and improving, the balance and then the strength, obviously, going forward.
That's it?
No, that's just the first part. So
that's the beginning.
Yeah, that's the beginning. And then each other day, so you've got 3 days where you're running, and then the other days you're doing some kind of cross training, and then 1 day a week is just like a recovery stretch day. And basically what you're doing is some kind of cross training. Now, we give you some examples in the book, like jump rope, cycling, rowing, and all those are really focused on kind of the endurance, functional capacity side of things. We always recommend jump rope for the first 8 weeks while you're transitioning. Because that's really where you're going to build some of that intrinsic foot strength while you're actually jumping. But then you're also getting eccentric contraction of the calf, which running and transitioning into a 4-foot motion means you're landing on the front or the middle of your foot, and then your heel is lowering down. And if you have not strengthened your calf or your gastroc, you're going to end up with tightness, with soreness, possibly some injuries if you do it, too long, too quickly. So the jump rope, doing that as a cross training gives you the added benefit of that you're not losing any endurance. You're building some of that functional capacity, but then you're also training those foot muscles and the gastroc for what will eventually be a long run landing on your midfoot. So those are the cross training days. And then there's just various strength exercises, and you're focused really on the posterior kinetic chain, which is, we mentioned it, your glutes, your hams, your calf muscles, a little bit of core work. And basically the idea there is that you're building the strength foundation for all of your running. So most people, most runners, and really people in the US in general, because we sit at a desk all day, and because of the way we overstride, a lot of times you get strong anterior kinetic chains. So your quads are very strong. Your hip flexors are tight. Most people can't extend their hip or like kick their leg back very, very far because it gets tight up in the kind of the iliopsoas area, the quad area. So we work on stretching those as well, and then strengthening your butt, your glute, your hamstrings, because those are going to end up pushing you or driving you forward in a forefoot pattern instead of kind of like pulling forward with your quad, right?
I heard something the other day. It was an interview with the author David Sedaris, who moved to France. And some people mentioned to him that he walked like an American. And he said, what does that mean? He says, you throw your legs in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what we do. We don't use our glutes and our hamstrings to extend, to push ourselves forward. We kind of throw our leg forward and kind of hop over it. So exactly. we're using the exact opposite muscles for what's optimal.
Yeah. And from like just a standard impact force of what that's doing, like when you overstride like that and you hit with your heel, not only are, you're working those quads a little bit more, but the energy transfer is basically like you've taken this straight rod and you've just jammed it into the ground. And so the force is going right up the kinetic chain, up your ankles, knees, into your hips and into your lower back. So it's not uncommon for runners to have, back pain or low back pain or hip pain. And a lot of times it's just they're striding and they're smacking the ground super, super hard. I was talking to a PT friend of mine the other day, and he owns a PT clinic as well. And one of his guys is really into running. And he was running on the treadmill, this PT friend of mine. And his colleague came in and was like, dude, you are so loud on this machine. It sounds like you're trying to bring down the building. And a lot of it was from that overstriding. So, a few things that he did was just, he shortened his stride length, increased his cadence. And the sound went from like thunk, 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 thunk to more like tap, 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 tap. And that's what you want when you're running. And we address that in the book as well. Like think about how fast your feet are moving, because the less time your feet are in the ground, one, it means there's less force coming up the back, but it also means you're running quicker. There's less impact. It's good for everybody. So that's kind of like the first phase is we're working on this cross training. We're working on strengthening the right muscles. Every single day you're doing these foot exercises and you're walking around for at least 2 hours a day barefoot. Some of our folks will try to break it up. Like I did an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. Sure. The goal is just to increase over time. Yeah. I always tell people, like, unless you're in public, there's really no reason for you to wear shoes.
I would argue that even if you are in public, it's totally cool. Depends on where you live, obviously. And like if you're in a beach community, then it's really easy to do that. So there's times where I'm in Costco in bare feet and they'll be like, parent and kids, and the kids will go, Mommy, that man's not wearing shoes. And if the parents are nice, they'll say, why don't you ask him about that? And they go, why, how come you don't wear shoes? I go, have you ever been to the beach? And they say, yeah. I go, do you wear shoes? They say, no. I go, why don't you just pretend we're at the beach? I go, okay. They're totally hip to it. It's also
parental problems everywhere now.
Well, that's my goal. It's also really fun. Like if you haven't been in a grocery store in bare feet where the floors are nice and smooth and cold on a really hot summer day, and then you go to the produce section right when the mister goes off and you just kind of hang out there. Oh man, that's the best.
Nice.
Well, so as we kind of bring things in for a landing, if people want to find out more, about you and what you're doing and the program in the book, let them know how they can do that.
Sure. Yeah. They can find us at pro-activehealth.com. We've got a tab there for running resources, but the book is called The Natural Runner, an 8-week training program to transition to barefoot or natural natural running without injuring yourself, I think.
There we go. And I love that you've adopted natural running, because my favorite thing, I wanted to bring this up earlier, is you watch kids learning to run. And this is everything we've talked about is how they naturally do it. They don't need any instruction. This is, and there's one other thing they do when they're running this way, which is it's a weird thing, smiling. Yeah. Yeah. They have a good time. Yeah. So Rafi, this has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm thrilled to hear your story, and I'm hoping that more people kind of inspired by it and understand just those little idiosyncratic differences as well. I mean, I like talking to people who have taken a dive into this, not just from their own experience, but also from the research side as well. But to highlight that it's not, people always ask, is there a program? And while you've created a program, I'm sure your experience has been that for some people it can go faster. Some people takes a little more time, less time. And that thing that you described of basically becoming your own coach by listening and experimenting, that's the best thing in my mind, because then you're not swayed by people's stories of that they think that they can make you better with some magic technology that doesn't really have any validity. And that's another one of my goals, to make people immune to marketing bullshit.
Yeah, well, we quote this article in the book, but the quote is something along the lines of like, we've invested so many millions of dollars in technology and running technology, but quote, like the perceived benefits of injury reduction with this running technology has not borne out in the literature, right? So,
not even in the literature, in the people who are doing the actual running. I mean, that's the thing. In the early days with maximalist shoes, I was training with a handful of Olympians, and I said to them, in 2 years, you won't be able to run again. And they're like, what are you, I'm putting in more miles than ever with these things. So I went, yeah, I know. Your knees will be blown out in 2 years. And 2 years later, they all switched to cycling. So, they literally couldn't run. And and ironically, they could now if they transitioned properly and got back into a natural form. But that, again, you tell people something that they don't believe, and their natural reaction is to disbelieve you, especially, coming from somebody like me, where I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher. I look the way I look, and I'm a sprinter. Put it all together. And I own a footwear brand. I mean, the irony is, and I wrote this line down the other day. I started a footwear company because I hate shoes so much, and which I think I have to make a video where that's the opening line just to see what happens, because people don't really get it. But anyway, do me a favor, give me URLs one more time for everyone.
Sure, it's pro-activehealth.com, and then the book is called The Natural Runner: An 8-Week Transition Program, something or other.
It'll be obvious when you get there. That's the point.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, A, thank you again. And B, I want to, we'll have to talk offline because I'd love to help promote what you're doing, since obviously it's what I believe in, and you've codified things in a way that we can add to our library of things for people to jump into. And by the way, speaking as a former competitive rope jumper, I love that you suggested that as well, because undeniably that can help build strength better and faster than almost anything other than running, frankly. So, and for everybody else, thank you for joining us. A reminder again, just head over to www.jointhemovementmovement.com. You'll find all the previous episodes, of which there are a bunch, and you'll find ways you can find us on social media. And if you want to drop me an email with a suggestion, a comment, someone you think should be on the show, whatever you want to toss in my direction, you can send that to move, MOVE, at jointhemovementmovement.com. And until next time, go out, have fun, and live life feet first.